Last week, the U.S. military held a congressional hearing regarding the widespread sightings of UAPs, or otherwise known as UFOs.
I urge us to put aside stigma and address the security and safety issue this topic represents. If UAP are foreign drones, it is an urgent national security problem. If it is something else, it is an issue for science.
UFO sightings are not a new phenomenon. They've been occurring all throughout history, being refracted through various cultural lenses. From fairies and dwarves to tiny little green men with big beady eyes, from celestial chariots and flying temples to now metallic dinner plates. I think UFO sightings require a deep analysis of both their cultural and psychological elements, along with their material and literal or physical elements. In this video, I will present Carl Jung's analysis of UFO sightings along with some predictions we can extrapolate from his work. Then we will take a look at the Senate hearings. So in 1959, Carl Jung published his study of UFO sightings. He proposes a very unorthodox opinion and theory about the phenomenon. The book itself is a result of 10 years spent studying various sightings and reading all the contemporary books he could get his hands on. As is usual with Carl Jung, he employs the tactic of circumambulation, giving us a bunch of different viewpoints of the same central concept. To begin, Carl Jung compares UFO sightings to a few events in history, including the visions of the Christian Crusaders prior to the siege of Jerusalem and the visions of the soldiers at Mons during the First World War. He also equates the sightings to various religious ceremonies that he's been a part of, where individuals that are participating in the ceremony will together hallucinate a certain object, but people outside of the ceremony wouldn't necessarily be able to see it. So far it seems that Jung is saying that these reports of UFOs are not actual entities, rather they are visions. And obviously this begs the question, what is causing the vision? They require two primary elements. First is an internal conflict that results in emotional tension, and the second is an ambiguous object to receive the inevitable projection. The vision, just like those of the Crusaders, lays the foundation of a new forming mythology. Jung states, UFOs have become a living myth. We have a golden opportunity to see how a legend is formed and how in a difficult and dark time for humanity, a miraculous tale grows up of an attempted intervention by extraterrestrial, quote-unquote, heavenly powers. The existence of UFO sightings is a fledgling faith just rearing its head for people to believe in. There are many other symbolic similarities that are shared between UFOs and other religious concepts. For one, the round shape echoes accounts of the biblical narrative of angels and anomalous flying objects. Additionally, UFOs are often reported as glowing or even on fire, another very ancient symbol of divinity. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of UFOs is how distinguished they are from the rest of reality. They're performing these miraculous movements and the things that are beyond the current conception of our sciences. This is really congruent with almost any sort of conception of divinity as something that is superior. Finally, Jung also comments on the shape of the UFOs being predominantly round. He says that UFOs are similar to a mandala, which is a worldwide symbol seen in almost every single religious tradition. It represents the totality of the individual and also the individual's relationship to a divine being. The God concept is often represented by the outer ring of the circle, as the circle represents a complete, perfect, and never-ending shape. So Carl Jung then goes into the analysis of dreams that he's done with various patients, reflecting on the presence of UFOs. This takes up a huge portion of the book, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but here are the high points. I think the first question that we have to ask is why look at dreams for any information relating to UFOs? So the argument here, and this is according to Carl Jung, is that by analyzing dreams, we're able to see the perspective of reality from the unconscious mind instead of just through the ego. So we know, and this has been confirmed by tons of studies, that ego consciousness is designed to distort reality in many ways, undergoing things like confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and of course the construction of information in relation to oneself. While in a dreaming state, the ego is obviously turned off and the mind enters a mode of increasing abstraction. This has actually recently been confirmed by neuroscientific data. Dreams usually begin in very concrete worlds with very concrete normal settings. As the dream progresses, the contents become more and more abstracted. We can think of it like going down the path of least resistance, constantly identifying new associations as time progresses in this state of mind. In other words, what was previously unknown to the ego can be identified in unconscious dreams, as they are a rich repository of various metaphors that can be conceptualized as the connections between different ideas that we're not usually aware of. So in analyzing dreams, you're able to understand your own brain's associations with these concepts without the distortion from consciousness. So from this, Carl Jung identifies a few key concepts that can be derived from dreams. The first is the autonomous nature of these UFOs. He records that many of his clients would report UFO dreams without ever actually seeing or experiencing a UFO, and some didn't even know what a UFO was. To him, this suggested that the mental representation of a UFO actually predates the experience of a UFO. The second point he emphasized was vigilance. The UFO experience is oftentimes associated with this feeling of being watched or being inspected, and in some cases people actually believe that they have been probed. These echo religious concepts like a guardian angel, the Eye of Horus, or just the all-seeing eye of God. Again, this is just more archetypal imagery that long predates the conception of UFOs, suggesting that there is a deeper element than just a materially existing object. And of course, coming out of the psychoanalytic tradition, Carl Jung identifies some masculine and feminine symbols. He mentions that the two most common shapes were circular or orb-shaped objects and cigar-shaped objects, which he says are indicative of the phallus and the womb, which again are representations of masculine and feminine element of what he perceives as the mind. The last thing that he identifies in these dreams is a consistent notion that these UFOs are being run or operated by otherworldly beings. He notices that they're oftentimes distorted forms of the human figure, whether it's the kind of traditional little alien that we're used to. There also been reports of dwarves, insect-like people, and reptile-like people. Figures like this are oftentimes seen in hallucinatory experiences, and they're called therianthropes. Therianthropes date back to even before the earliest recorded religious traditions. Again, a little bit more evidence to suggest that these concepts predate the idea of a UFO. Jung continues his examination by analyzing some art from the 1500s and 1600s. I won't go into too much detail, but here's just one art piece I want to focus on. It shows UFO-like figures as the individual peers through the fabric of reality, suggesting again that UFOs are literally out of this world from a different plane of existence. Of course, this has been molded to meet the current scientific paradigm. Instead of being outside of our realm of reality, they're just from a distant, galaxy or star cluster. Carl Jung obviously realized that not all these sightings could simply be explained by just psychological factors like visions. They oftentimes appear on radar and even in photographs. He really comes up with two primary explanations for this. He says, quote, either psychic projections throw back a radar echo, or else the appearance of real objects affords an opportunity for mythological projections. So those familiar with Carl Jung's metaphysics know that he perceived reality as entirely experiential, that without consciousness the world cannot be known to exist, and that consciousness is the fundamental, irreducible nature of reality. For this reason, psychological events could impact physical reality, and physical reality can influence psychological events, because the material world is not any different than the psychic world. They're made up of the same fundamental, you could call it element, and that element would be consciousness. So what can we learn about Carl Jung's exploration of UFOs? It's certainly clear that UFOs strike some kind of latent emotion. He brings up the example of H.G. Wells. On the radio, it said that the Martians were invading New York City, and it resulted in tons of people getting trampled in a huge stampede, basically leaving the city with multiple car crashes. In other words, this was at the tip of people's mind. It's something that people have worried about. Another very common theme is the repercussions of nuclear technology. According to Carl Jung, the unconscious repercussions of the development of nuclear technology has led to humanity's psychological guilt regarding the events. The development of nuclear weaponry was not just an incredible display of scientific power, but really represented one of humanity's darkest moments. And now the idea is that we're paying the price for that. And we're paying it psychologically. Another thing we can learn is that there's this innate human desire to identify some type of divine or superior beings. And of course, the idea of a faraway civilization of aliens sending their advanced technology to come visit us is a perfect kind of bending of religious traditions for the current scientific paradigm. Another thing we can learn from his exploration is this idea that people are very much against any symbolic or metaphorical or mythological imagery that emerges in everyday life. Instead of projecting this idea of a god or an angel or a chariot or a temple onto these what are ambiguous kind of stimuli in our environment, we're projecting these technologically advanced beings onto those ambiguous things, and it tells us a lot about ourselves and our current state of mind, that we don't want to admit that maybe the there is some kind of metaphorical or mythological aspect that could be projected onto that. Rather, it has to stay in the confines of the ego and the scientific mind. Another fascinating thing he mentions is a splitting of the unified monotheistic Godhead. Instead of people seeing the same thing or people seeing, one being, people are seeing a bunch of different little divine beings. And he kind of alludes to the fact that this is perhaps a movement from monotheism back towards polytheism. Another thing he mentions is that we have no universal symbol for totality, and for this reason we've kind of created our own, again through the current paradigm. Jung says, in other words, the rounded wholeness of the mandala becomes a spaceship controlled by an intelligent being. So as you can imagine, Carl Jung's theory in his book have huge implications for the physical and material evidence that has come out regarding aliens and UFOs and UAPs. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Senate hearing and what we can learn from it and how it relates to Carl Jung's theory. So one of the first things that I noticed were that out of the three people that testified in Congress, they didn't agree on much, but one thing that they did agree on was that these aliens or these probes were interested in our nuclear technology. This kind of further echoes Carl Jung's own theory about us being hyper vigilant about this newfound power, this destructive power that we have created. As if to say, we have done something so powerful and potentially destructive that it has literally changed the entire universe, potentially requiring some type of borderline divine intervention. Jung also suggests that UFO sightings from top military personnel is no surprise and should actually have been expected, despite being the ones trained and conditioned to avoid such misperceptions. The reason for this, according to Carl Jung, is that military personnel oftentimes are in positions that they're in precisely because they're able to kind of suppress the unconscious and get rid of the imaginative aspect of their lives. So in order for communication to occur between the divided mind, there has to be a more intense experience of the unconscious. A very good example of this is actually Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his conversion on the road to Damascus. It required a huge stimulus for him to believe that the Christian God existed, precisely because he was an individual who persecuted Jews and had a very particular perspective on that, a very ingrained perspective. Personally, I think Grush's testimony is most earth-shattering and most at odds with Carl Jung's theory. Obviously, nothing he has been verified yet, but if true, you can imagine this really does hurt Jung's theory and takes this whole thing that Carl Jung has kind of put into the sphere of the mind and brings it into reality. The last thing I want to do in this video is end it with some predictions. Carl Jung doesn't necessarily predict anything, but certainly reasonable predictions can be extrapolated from the text. I want to do this so that someday I can look back and be like, was this guy right? So the first big prediction is that UFO sightings will correlate with the division of humanity. As people become more and more divided, we should expect a rise in the presence of UFOs. And obviously the big overarching prediction is that unambiguous evidence of UFOs, of the existence of aliens even, will never fully be achieved. Just like the death and resurrection in Christian mythology will never be definitively proven, the same can be said of UFOs. This doesn't mean that individuals won't have very convincing experiences, but they will happen more on an individual basis than like the whole country. Again, this is similar to the Christian narrative of the apostles seeing Christ, feeling him, together hallucinating his presence, but nonetheless Christ never became a figure that was fully real to the point where it was unambiguous and it wasn't even a question. Another prediction is that the conception of extraterrestrials will kind of remain in the idea that they are our saviors. Our conception of extraterrestrials will never be that of an inferior species that wants to come and assimilate or even serve humanity, even though those are absolutely a possibility. Rather, they will be strictly thought of as superior, whether that be morally or just physically superior. Even though the possibilities are genuinely limitless, a certain perspective will be picked out. Even though it's entirely possible that the aliens want to just drill into the core of the earth or something and hibernate. But that will never be the predominant narrative. Probably like a lot of people watching this video, I was very excited about the Senate hearings and about the information coming out. I genuinely do hope that aliens are real, because that would be epic. It'd be like the biggest event in human history if they were actually determined to be legitimate. I think I speak for a lot of people that there's this underlying desire for aliens to be real. And I think this speaks exactly to what Carl Jung is saying. It's just like the ancient Jewish cultures that had this fiery passion for a Messiah. Unfortunately, I don't think that irrefutable evidence will ever be presented proving without a doubt the existence of aliens and UFOs. I hope that one day I can look back and be like, yep, I was completely wrong and so was Carl Jung, because that would be exciting. but I just don't think that's the case. I genuinely hope they're real, so I will be following the Senate hearings closely, but obviously cautiously, and I urge you to do the same. Of course, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down below. Are these instances of UFOs simply projections of the mind, or are they real material entities that have come to visit Earth?